Okay, we're going to cover section 17.1 and 17.2. So here comes 17.1 first, genes and variation. Researchers discovered that, again, heritable traits are controlled by genes. Changes in genes and chromosomes create genetic variation. For example, all of these these children receive their genes from their same parents. Well, there was a picture, I think I erased it, but children, again, you and your siblings come from your parents. You share similar genes, but yet you look different. So there's some variation that you inherit. Looking at genotype and phenotype and evolution, an organism's genotype is the particular combination of alleles it carries. An individual's genotype, together with environmental conditions, produces genotype. So the phenotype includes all physical, physiological, and behavioral characteristics of an organism. But when you're looking at natural selection acts directly on phenotypes and not the genotypes. So some individuals have phenotypes that are better suited to their environment than others. These individuals produce more offspring and pass on more copies of their genes to the next generation. So a population is a group of individuals of the same species that mate and produce offspring. When you're looking at population, you reference usually a gene pool. The gene pool consists of all the genes, including all the different alleles for each gene that are present in a population. Researchers study gene pools by examining the relative frequency of an allele. The relative frequency of an allele is the number of times a particular allele occurs in a gene pool compared with the number of times other alleles for the same gene occur. For example, this diagram down here shows the gene pool for fur color in a population of mice. So we see between the 48% and 16%, we have black colored mice. 36% of the population are homozygous for the brown trait. So 48% are heterozygous for black, 16% here, it got cut off, is homozygous black. So these are the allele frequencies of that population. Evolution is any change in the relative frequency of alleles in the gene pool of a population over time. Because again, evolution is another way of saying change. Natural selection operates on individuals, but resulting in changes in allele frequency show up in populations. So populations, rather than individuals, evolve. Looking at sources of genetic variation, mutations in sexual reproduction bring variation into a population. Mutations that produce changes in phenotype may or may not affect fitness, whether something is going to reproduce a lot of offspring or not. Some mutations may be lethal or may lower fitness, others may be beneficial. Mutations matter in evolution only if they can be passed from generation to generation. So therefore, the mutation must occur in the germline cells, meaning in your sperm and egg cells, to be passed on to the next generation. Another type of variation is lateral gene transfer. This occurs when organisms pass genes from one individual to another that is not its offspring. It can occur between organisms of the same species or organisms of different species. Lateral genes, so lateral, when you're talking about lateral, it means like from side to side. Lateral gene transfer can increase genetic variation in a species that picks up the quote-unquote new genes. So for example, the exchange of a gene from a human cell into the bacterium Neisseria gonorrhoeae, a transfer that appears to have occurred relatively recently in the bacterium's evolution, so that's the bacteria that causes gonorrhea, may have enabled the organism to adapt and survive in humans. So that's beneficial for the bacteria, not so beneficial for humans. Single trait genes. So when you're looking at a single trait gene, it's a trait controlled by only one gene. So we've seen that last semester with monohybrid crossing. Single gene traits may have just 2 or 3 distinct phenotypes. The most common form of an allele can be dominant or recessive. So dominance of an allele for a single gene trait does not necessarily mean that the dominant phenotype will always appear with greater frequency in a given population. An example of a single gene trait is the presence of dark bands that appear on the shells of a certain species of snails. Even though the allele for shells without bands is dominant, a population may show a greater frequency of the with bands phenotype. And then we're going to start looking more into polygenic traits. These again are controlled by 2 or more genes. Each gene of a polygenic trait often have 2 or more alleles. A single polygenic trait may have may often have as many possible genotypes and even more different phenotypes. So it's like, for example, skin color. You have a whole spectrum of skin colors, a whole spectrum of heights. Those are prime examples of polygenic traits. Human height, again, which varies from very short to very tall, is an example of a polygenic trait. This is a typical bell curve to show the polygenic trait. So an average height is the more frequent one, really short, not so frequent, really, really tall, not so frequent. Okay, I'm going to pause it here and get to the next section. Okay, now we're back. We're switching over to section 17.2, evolution as genetic change in populations. So how natural selection works. Evolutionary fitness is the success in passing genes to the next generation. So can you live long enough and have as many babies as possible? Evolutionary adaptation is any genetically controlled trait that increases an individual's ability to pass along its alleles, which again translates into a higher fitness. Natural selection for a single trait gene can lead to changes in allele frequencies and then to evolution. For example, a mutation in one gene that determines body color in lizards can affect their lifespan. So here's the initial population, 80% black or brown, 10% red, and 10% black. So if the normal color for lizards is brown, a mutation may produce red and black forms right here. If red lizards are more visible to predators, they might be less likely to survive and reproduce. So therefore, that allele might decrease in numbers here. Therefore, the allele for red coloring might not become very common. Black lizards might be able to absorb sunlight, so their higher body temperatures may allow the lizards to move faster, escape predators, and reproduce. So for single trait gene traits here, the allele for black color might become more common. So as you saw here, over time, we went from 10% to 60% of the population. They were able to survive and reproduce longer than the brown ones, so the brown population decreased in frequency. Polygenic traits have a range of phenotypes that often form a bell curve. So this pattern here is called a bell curve. The fitness of individuals may vary from one end of the curve to the other. Natural selection can affect the range of phenotypes and hence the shape of the bell curve, whether it's going to be really wide. We're going to see different shapes in the next few slides. So for example, we can have something called directional selection, and this occurs when individuals at one end of the curve have higher fitness than individuals in the middle or the other end. The range of phenotypes shifts because more individuals are more successful at surviving and reproducing. For example, if only large seeds were available, birds with larger beaks would have an easier time feeding and would be more successful in surviving and passing on genes. So if larger beaks, in the previous population were at the end here, well then in the new population over time, the average, the most number of birds that would have a larger beak size. So larger size, you'll always see a shifting, either the bell curve shifting to the right or shifting to the left in directional selection. It's going one direction or the other. Stabilizing selection occurs when individuals near the center of the curve have a higher fitness than individuals at the end. So you'll always see the bell curve peak and get skinny at the ends here and get higher in the average part, the tip of the bell. This situation keeps the center of the curve at its current position, but it narrows the overall graph. For example, very small and very large babies are less likely to survive than average-sized individuals. So the fitness of these smaller and larger babies is therefore lower than your more average-sized baby. So a 4-pound baby won't survive as much as maybe like a 7 or 8-pound baby. A 12-pound baby, usually kind of hard to push out naturally. So before C-sections, definitely bigger babies did not survive as much, maybe even the moms, compared to the average-sized babies. Disruptive selection occurs when individuals at the upper and lower ends of the curve have a higher fitness than individuals near the middle. Disruptive selection acts against individuals of an intermediate type and can create two distinct phenotypes. For example, in an area where medium-sized seeds are less common, birds with usually small or large beaks have a higher fitness. Therefore, the population might split into two groups, one with smaller beaks, one with larger beaks. So here, the original population, the dotted line here, the middle phenotype not as successful. So then you have peaks at maybe the smaller beak area and a peak at the larger beak area. Genetic drift. Okay, genetic drift occurs in small populations when an allele becomes more or less common simply by chance. So genetic drift is a random change in allele frequencies. So it's just random, just like natural selection. A couple ways you can have this, something called bottleneck effect. This is a change in allele frequency following a dramatic reduction in size and population. For example, a disaster may kill many individuals in a population, and the surviving population's gene pool may contain different gene frequencies in the original gene pool. So here's the original gene pool, some disaster happened, so this is a model, where maybe only a few individuals survive, and those surviving individuals would restart the population. So here we see no yellow beads. We have many of the blue beads, but only one white bead. So we have a different frequency of alleles compared to the original population. Another one's called founder effect. It occurs when allele frequencies change as a result of the migration of a small subgroup of a population. Two groups from a large, diverse population could produce new populations that differ from the original group. So here we see different colored beetles compared to the overall original population. In case an example, the Amish population came from, we had 200 founders that came from the areas of Germany and Switzerland. In that population, one of the original 200 Amish founders had this Ellis von Creveld syndrome, which is a dwarfism, and they have an extra finger. So that Amish population actually has one of the highest frequencies of that syndrome. So this is a case in point of founder effect. Okay, evolution versus genetic equilibrium. A population is in genetic equilibrium if allele frequencies in this population remain the same. So if allele frequencies don't change, then the population won't evolve, because again, evolution is a change over time. So there's something called the Hardy-Weinberg principle. The Hardy-Weinberg principle describes the conditions under which evolution does not occur. The Hardy-Weinberg principle states that allele frequencies in a population remain constant unless one or more factors cause those frequencies to change. So we're going to go through those principles right now. So we must have a large population. Genetic drift can cause changes in allele frequencies in small populations. Genetic drift has less effect on large populations, such as the seal. Well, there was a picture of seals, but I got rid of that. Large population size helps maintain genetic equilibrium. So we know that's not always the case. We're going to be seeing in the next few slides that Hardy-Weinberg is doesn't usually happen in nature, because you're always going to have allele frequencies changing. Another thing for equilibrium is if mutations, if you can't have any mutations, which of course never happens. If mutations occur, new alleles may be introduced into the gene pool and allele frequencies will change. So that's another case where you won't have equilibrium. So in order to have equilibrium, you'd need a population that has no mutations, which again would rarely ever happen. Another rare thing of random mating, all members of the population must have an equal opportunity to produce offspring. Individuals must mate with other members of the population at random. Again, that rarely happens. So in natural populations, however, mating is not random. Female peacocks, for example, choose mates on the basis of physical characteristics such as brightly patterned tail feathers. Such non-random mating means that alleles for those traits are under selection pressure. Another one, no immigration or emigration. So when individuals come into a population, they're going to bring new alleles. When they leave, they're going to remove alleles. Thus, for no alleles to flow into or out of a gene pool, there must be no movement of individuals into or out of a population. Natural selection, no natural selection. All genotypes in the population must have equal probabilities of surviving and reproducing. So no phenotype can have a selective advantage over another. Again, that would never really happen. So again, populations are always going to be evolving. Sexual reproduction and allele frequencies. Meiosis and fertilization does not change the relative frequency of alleles in a population. The shuffling of genes during sexual reproduction produces many different gene combinations, but does not alter their relative frequencies of alleles in the population. So this is something that wouldn't affect the genetic equilibrium. So all those principles that we went through are instances where you would need that to happen for a population to remain in equilibrium. But you never really see that actually happening in nature. You're always going to see different allele frequency changes happening. Okay, that is it. Thank you.